I am pleased to have an opportunity to introduce Dr. Umesh Kumar. He has been with Department of English, Banaras Hindu University since 2015. Apart from teaching canonical courses in British literature, he is a practicing translator and works with language pairs English, Hindi, Marathi, either way. He has been trained at leading translation schools of the world. Notable among them are NIDA, School of Translation Studies, Italy, and British Centre for Literary Translation, the University of East Anglia, UK. For 2019-20, he was British Consul Charles Valence Visiting Professor Fellows at University of Edinburgh, UK. His essays and translations have appeared in Satya Academy, Translation Today, Contemporary Voice of Dalit, the Book Review, Indian Literature, Vani Prakashan, The Hindu, The Wire, among others. Now I invite Dr. Umesh Kumar to deliver the lecture on topic Doing Literary Translation, a Beginner's Introduction. Now it's over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thanks a lot to the NTM team for inviting me. In fact, I have been a regular visitor to National Translation Mission. So it means two things. Either I have done some mass fixing or I have been making attempts to say something worthwhile. So we'll test that particular assumption as well today by getting into a conversation that is very, very dear to my heart. Before we start the discussion, I think it is important that I should give some clarification about my topic. In spite of the fact that I think that my topic is self-explanatory, I believe that it is important for me to describe every word that I have put in the title, because I think the capital of my talk is located in my title. So I hope that you are able to see my screen now. I have titled it Doing Literary Translations, a Beginner's Introduction. Now, if you look the dictionary meaning of the word doing, it is actually an action-oriented term. And by now, you must have realized that translation studies is a umbrella term. Within translation studies, there are many other things. For example, translation history, translation practice, translation theories. So within translation studies, there are different objects of inquiries. But one thing you must have realized by now is that translation is a action-oriented thing. So it is about doing. And there is another usage of this word called doing when somebody says in English that it will take some doing. So in other words, when you use this word that it will take some doing, you are saying primarily that it is challenging. It will have challenges. So by using the word doing, I'm also hinting towards the idea of challenges embedded in translation studies and particularly in translation practice. The other word in my title is literary translation. I'm again sure that by now you must have realized that there are different ways in which translation works. For example, translation of the administrative vocabularies, translation of the financial vocabularies, translation of, say, judicial proceedings, translation of knowledge text, because NTM is primarily engaged in translating knowledge text. But in my talk, I am going to focus on literary translations. And I think the history of literary translations is as old as the practice of translation itself. And some people believe that literary translations are the most complex entities of translation for a practicing translator. I do not buy that argument. I personally do not agree with that argument, because I believe that every translation has its own challenges. But to cut the long story short, I'm trying to say that I'm going to focus on what we understand as translation of Sahitya, translation of literature, which includes a variety of genres, for example, poems, short stories. You can just keep on discussing those genres. I was trying to decode my title, and I was saying that I'm focusing on literary translations. And I'm also saying that my talk is an intention to lure the potential translators. So that's why I'm calling it as a beginner's introduction. So what do I mean by introduction? And what do I mean by the term beginner? Beginner is anybody who wishes to engage into translation practice, and I'm assuming that that intention also comes from the fact that a person feels confident in two languages, at least. So what my introduction is going to include? My introduction is going to include the basic elements of getting into translation practice. And I'm going to focus on the backyard of translation practice. I'm not talking about the front yard. Front yard is very glossy, looks wonderful. You know how we take care of our front yards. Front yard of a house. We really take care of it. But we are not bothered about the backyard. Backyard is some kind of a backstage, offstage, dumping ground, something like that. So my focus is actually on the backyard of translation practice. What goes behind bringing out a book of translation? What are the challenges that a translator has to face while bringing out a book? So to summarize, my focus is on doing translations, and what is the backstory when a book comes out in the public. And as I've said that it is a action-oriented thing, I must also give proof of what I have done. So in spite of the fact that this looks like a self-promotion, I'm focusing on my own translations. Two books that I have translated. One I have co-translated from Marathi to Hindi, and the other book I have translated on my own from Hindi to English. So this is the first book, The Laughing Flames and Other Poems, which I have translated, and it has come out from Sahitya Akademi. The next book is Kisson Ki Duniya, which is a translation in Hindi from Marathi, and it is co-translated by Pramod Padwal and myself. So I'm going to focus on these two books in order to draw my material that I have to share with you. Now, I'll stop sharing the screen for some time and will get back to you. I hope that I'm visible. So when you do a thought experiment, and I would urge all of you to do this thought experiment, that if translation is about doing, then what are the spaces where translation becomes visible? Apart from the fact that there are many publication houses that bring out translations, and we never get to know as to how these people have got these opportunities to translate. We just see the book. We are not able to see how this translator was identified, what was his eligibility, how he got this chance, and so on and so forth. And somehow I believe that the front yard has taken over the backyard. So when you do this thought experiment of how many journals do actually publish translations, actual translations in India, please help me find out a journal which is not translation today or Indian literature. So in spite of the fact that we have a very fertile ground for actual translations, we do not have credible space where the budding translators can publish their work, apart from the publication houses, which of course works through a very problematic, complex, and I would dare say with some kind of a nexus. So one translator keeps on getting different assignments one after the other. And that may apply to me as well after some years. So I'm more concerned about the potential translators who wish to get into the field. And not only that, even if you search at the European platforms, I have done this experiment myself, there are hundreds of credible, wonderful Scopus Index journals on translation studies, which theorize translation practices, but they have no space for actual translations. So, in a way, what problem I'm facing today as a potential translator is also a problem that is being faced by translation studies in India. Now, this is an argument that you might say that it's a very arrogant argument as to what is happening to you. How can you relate it with translation studies in India? But whatever be the subjective ramifications of such an argument, I still consider that translation studies in India is an evolving field to such an extent that in spite of the fact that we see translation theory, translation history, translation practice as separate entities, I would argue that we must see them together. Because whatever experiences I am having today as a potential translator will be part of translation history after some years. So translation history, translation practice, and translation theorization must be seen together as cooperative pursuits of the discipline of translation. So this is my problem that I actually wanted to share with you. Now, when you think of getting into the field, let me clarify that there are two ways in which you can get a translation assignment. One is by commissioned method. The other one is by putting up a proposal or sending your manuscript to a particular journal or a publisher. Now, the two examples that I have shared with you, one was Aag Ki Hasi, which I have translated as The Laughing Flames and Other Poems. It was actually a commissioned work. So Sahitya Akademi, which is the biggest publisher of translations in India, believes in commissioned translations. So even if you go and search the Sahitya Akademi website, you will not be able to find an icon that talks about submissions. They have an advisory board for every subject, every language, so to speak. And this advisory board is independent, autonomous, and it suggests the names of potential translators who can translate a particular work. Now, the way an advisory board functions, you know that it could be very subjective in its opinion. But what we can do in order to become a part of that opinion is something that I would like to share. So it is not in our hands as to who is going to name us, but we can play our part by becoming visible in the translation field. So by now, I'm sure that you must have been acquainted with many theories on translation, and particularly the linguistic theories on translation. You must have also got to know about visibility and invisibility of translators. So I'm talking about a more humble aspect of that visibility, that we have to be visible, that we are translators and we translate from this language to that language. So when I was approached to translate this particular book by Ramdaras Mishra, which was awarded Sahitya Akademi in 2015, the title of the book was Aag Ki Hasi. And would you believe it, that somebody read a short story that I translated and published in Translation Today. This is actually a very well-known short story of Premchand in Hindi. And the title of that story is Sawa Ser Gehu. So we know that Translation Today has a lot of credibility in the Indian translation scene. So somebody just accessed that translation that I have done, and it got published on the TT platform. And that particular short story, which I think was a proof of my visibility, provided an example to one member of this advisory board, and who thought that that person can push my candidature as a potential translator. So that is how things happen in a commissioned translation. Now, I will show you how a commissioned translation works and what is the politics. I'm using the word politics in the broader sense, not in the narrower way. So I will show you the copy of my contract that I got from Sahitya Akademi, and I will also highlight some of the areas that we must know as potential translators. So this is the contract, and you get the contract, but before that you have to submit a sample translation. Okay, so for example, if you are asked to translate a book, they will ask you to translate, say, first 30 pages or first 40 pages, or maybe one chapter of the book or two chapters of the book. So the usual length, if it is a fictional work, the usual length of sample translation is around 3,000 to 4,000 words, because that quantity is enough to give a flavor of the book, the flavor of the language and the writer's intention. So when I submitted the sample translation, it got approved. And after this sample translation is over, you are given a contract. And this is how the contract begins, which is, of course, very important for us to see. And I'm reading the English part. Of course, there is a Hindi version as well. One of the programs of the Sahitya Akademi is to publish translation of books, including its own publications and classics, into all the major languages of India. Needless to say, and this is the point that you must focus, needless to say, a good translation should be as faithful to the original as possible. I'm putting the word faithful in single inverted commas. without sacrificing lucidity and vigor of expression. Whatever, I shall be glad. So in a commissioned translation, in a way, the method of translation is already decided by the person who is commissioning that translation. Okay, so there is no scope for you to go over the board. I will also discuss what that over the board thing is when I'll take some more examples, but this is how the thing works. But I'll take you to the detailed conditions. Okay. And the first one is important, that if the translator knows that there already exists a translation of this particular book, then he must inform the publisher. Well, that is problematic because, we have this wonderful classic by Jyotiba Phule, Gulamgiri, and it has been translated as slavery. But its first English translation is horrible, which came around the 1980s. So does that mean that if a book has already been translated, it should not be translated again? Is a question that we should ponder over. And there is another thing which I wanted to highlight here, is how they are going to accept it. Okay. And the acceptance factor is again, depends upon what kind of method that you have used. So if you have completely reversed what the book's literal meaning is, then it would be rejected, and so on and so forth. So this is an example of commissioned translation. Let us come back to what we were discussing. Yeah, so a commissioned translation has its own problems and own complexities. But as a beginner, I think we should grab whatever comes our way, because when we want to make our own book proposal. Now, in no way I'm saying that these complexities and these problems do not exist for the translations which are not commissioned. These things may also carry forward in the same way as happens in the commissioned translation. But commissioned translations are much more controlled, is the point that I wanted to highlight. So as a translator, your job is actually to make an attempt to create an exact rendering, what we understand as literal translation, word-to-word translation. And believe you me, when I submitted my first draft, I was very assured of this point. And when the comments came on the first draft, both the reviewers said that the translation is too faithful to the original. Now, can you see the contradiction that the written assignment is forcing me to be faithful? By the way, this faithful word is very problematic. I'm using it for convenience, not for clarity. Because when you say faithful, you are also entering into the sexual terminologies. The word faithful was often used for women, with regards to their sexuality, and I just wonder how it entered into translation studies. Maybe because of the male dominance on translation for a long time. So the reviewer said that I'm too faithful, and I must also judiciously use my own position as a translator wherever I can in order to create a much nuanced rendering of the text. So as a potential translator, you will often be faced with these contradictions in translation field. When it comes to sending or making your own proposal for a book to be translated, the things are a little different. And there are certain things that you must be careful when you're making your own book proposal. First of all, you must think about the copyright of the book. It is really problematic that the translation theorist And I would request uh, my brother Tariq to tell me more on this if he knows that there is not much discussion in translation theory on the idea of copyright of a text, because as potential translators this is the biggest problem that we are going to face, because we are going to go all over to find the copyright of the text, and eventually we will realize that we are not able to get it. That is not the problem with the commissioned text, because when a text is commissioned, the body that is commissioning you ensures that they already have a copyright of the text. But in that situation, the translator also ceases to hold any copyright over her translation as well. So, for example, the book that is brought out by Sahitya Akademi, I have no copyright over my translation. So, if I want to reproduce my translation, I must take permission from Sahitya Akademi because they are controlling it. And that's the usual thing in most of the commissioned translations. But when you put your own book proposal, when you put it to uh, a publisher, usually they give the copyright of the translation to the translator. Okay, and this is again a part of my growing up as a translator, that before I actually entered into the field as a translator, I for many years was doing this pleasure reading of translated books in India, because that actually gives you a kind of training that is not usually available to us. Because although Tariq and I would argue that translation should be a cooperative pursuit, but it always remains an individual sort of an enterprise. So the self-training of the translator before she enters into the field is again a prerequisite of translation practice, because when you train yourself by reading a host of books from your language, which have been either translated from your language to other language or from other languages to your language, you actually map how your language is evolving with respect to receiving and uh, forwarding translations. So for 3-4 years during my PhD days, it was a pleasure thing for me to read a translated book and then also read the original, either in Hindi or in Marathi. So by doing that, I developed a sense of what kind of vocabulary that is being used in translation in my language. And other question would be, how would we get to know about which books are being translated? Well, there are different channels. One is, of course, this the magazine of the Hindu newspaper that comes every week. It reviews many books, including translations. Then there is another prominent Indian journal called The Book Review. I think all of us should have an access to that. It's a wonderful journal. It also reviews most of the prominent books that have been translated or come out in translation. So this particular period that I'm referring to was also a training period for me as a translator. And of course, you have to continuously work on your language, the way you use language, and so on and so forth. So apart from self-training yourself, you also have to train as to how you are going to put up a book proposal and how you are going to convince Tariq Khan that he must publish this particular short story in the forthcoming issue of his journal, Translation Today, for example. One way of doing it would be to strongly pitch the book or the short story or any other genre that you want to publish. And pitching is very important. It's a go-to word in translation, that you have to pitch your translation properly. What do I mean by pitching? First of all, you must tell why this particular text is so important in the contemporary times, or does it help us to understand our contemporary times better? Because if we go back to this book, which was written, say, 200 years back, so you have to be an advocate of the translation that you are doing. And you must always be aware of why you're translating. And this is very important for me, And I think now it is also becoming important for translation studies, because now translation studies is slowly and gradually moving from translation studies to translator studies. Okay, so when you say translator studies, it means that the focus is now on the agent. Translator is the agent, on the agent who does the translation. So you have to decide as to why you are translating any particular thing that you want to do, because this would go a long way in defining the overall texture of the final product. So, for example, are you translating for the mercenary reasons? Are you translating for money? Of course, there is nothing wrong in that. Are you translating for political or ideological purposes? Are you a committed translator? You are translating it because you are committed to this particular cause. So you must be absolutely sure about why you are translating a particular thing. So in your proposal, either you write, for example, if you're putting it to TT, whenever you're putting a short story or a poem, you must write a strong translator's note. And translator's note is something that is very important for a translator, because this is the only space in the text where the translator is able to say why he has done this, what are the methods that he has used. So a translator's note is a great opportunity. Always use it, although it is a different thing that now publishers are not able to see the real reason behind a translator's note. For example, a recent series of translations was brought out by Ratna Books. It has some 10, 15 translated books from different Indian languages. And you see that most of these books, translated books, do not carry any translator's note. Not even an introduction to the writer whose work has been translated. So I think for us as translators, it is always important that we must stress our agency. For example, when I was doing this Sahitya Akademi book, they were registering to the fact that I am actually writing a big introduction, or I am writing a translator's note. But I put my foot down and I said that it is very important for the text to be contextualized. And how can you contextualize the text without writing a description of it, without giving an explanation of, for example, I have not used punctuation marks in this poetry translation. So if I will not tell it, the casual English reader will think that this is the carelessness of the translator. So I must tell it in my translator's note that I'm using this method because the poet has used it in the original. And there is a politics behind it, because the poet thinks that his poem doesn't end, but one poem is actually giving organic way to the poem that is to come. So although there are 60, 70 poems, but he also thinks that this is a single poem which talks about different facets of our contemporary life. So what I'm trying to say is that you have to make attempts to make your translations thick, Thick, thick translations, because it is only through thick translations that you are able to do the job. Now it is also your choice. It's not, again, a prescription. It is primarily a suggestion. I would follow thick translations if I'm not translating children's literature, for example. And I will show you what it means to do thick translations. So when you are pitching for a book, please be sure that you know who holds the copyright. Either you have taken the copyright from the original holder or his family members, whatever. You know whether this book has been translated earlier or not. If it has been earlier translated, why you want to translate it now, what are the problems in the preceding translation. And of course, you must be very careful about the market of the book, because this is what private publishing is all about. It is always thinking about the monetary aspects of translation. So will there be a readership for this particular book? Uh, is the book on identity politics? You see, we have a strong wave of Dalit autobiographies being translated. These Dalit autobiographies existed from 1980s, but we see a strong wave of these translations in the early 2000s. You know, it is going on even now. So you must be aware of what kind of book that you are translating. In other words, I'm saying that whatever you are translating or you are thinking to translate, you must own that. The sense of ownership is very important for any translator, because once you own it, then I think you are able to protect it. And as translators, uh, I think we are also ambassadors of our languages. We should not lose sight of it. This may look too nationalist, but I believe that when we are translating, we are also playing the role of ambassador from whatever language we are translating to the different language. And that's why, of course, that is the reason that every translation act is a political translation. So we must not lose sight of these points that that I'm trying to suggest. Other important thing is, what are the major sort of challenges that you get when you translate? One can go about the challenges, for hours together, but I have put up certain instances of those challenges, and I would like to share with you because that would give you some glimpse of, uh, and I'm sure that the other speakers may have also talked about it. I was going through the list of presentations. So well, this is something I'm sharing with a risk, but I don't mind taking it. I translated a short story and I actually submitted it to a reputed publisher. This short story was published in 1990s, and it created a lot of debate in the literary world. But in a sense, nothing dangerous happened. Okay. But when I translated it in 2019 and I submitted to an English journal, this is also a turning point for us, because we believe that English journals are much more liberal. I mean, there's this stereotypical image associated with English publishing, that very few people are going to read it, how many people have access to English language in India, and so on and so forth. But if you read this explanation, this is very interesting, and it is also a takeaway for us. It says, but I have second thoughts about the story now. Reading newspaper accounts today of things happening to writers and editors involving alleged incidents of provoking communal discord, instigating enmity between communities, etc., things happening over the last few months, and the controversial cases involving intellectuals, I think it is better to avoid publishing potentially controversial material in this journal, name of the journal. Though I know the story is a masterpiece and accepted as such when it was published, things of late have become very complicated. Please think it over. If you could send me a story that does not name particular communities, I could consider that. It would be much better under the circumstances. So I think the editor's note is self-explanatory, that as writers, they have to be careful, but I think as translators, we must also be careful. So this particular thing also must be accounted. What are the potential threats, or are you in a position to take those threats? So this idea of censorship, not only that the translator has to employ it when he's translating the text, but it also come to the fore. It also comes to the fore when you are at the verge of publishing it. And well, since I've told you the thing, it was almost at the fag end when the story was almost published that one is forced to, you know, pull out. Okay, so that is also an important thing for us to understand as translators. I'll show you a bit more on what are the potential challenges that you would encounter. And of course, there are many challenges, but in my own humble way, I'm just making an attempt to put some examples. Yeah, so from the short stories and couple of books that I've translated, I've drawn these particular examples from there. So this is actually a very famous short story by Mannu Bhandari in Hindi. And the title of the story is Ek Plate Sailab. Okay. And there are different instances in this, but I would just read it and I would tell you what is the potential threat here as a translator. Although these threats were never faced by these writers writing in the original language. That is another sort of object of inquiry for us as translation theorists. So it says, I'm sure that there are many people from the other part where Hindi is not that prominent, our South Indian friends, but I will translate it. But my purpose here is to tell what is the danger. So it describes a girl who is actually singing in a party, and she is being given company by another person who is also playing on some other musical instrument. गहरा मेकअप किए डायस पर जो लड़की गा रही है, उसने अपनी स्कर्ट की बेल्ट खूब कसकर बांध रखी है, जिससे उसकी पतली कमर और भी पतली दिखाई दे रही है, और उसकी तुलना में छातियों का उभार कुछ और मुखर हो उठा है। एक हाथ से उसने माइक का डंडा पकड़ रखा है और जूते की टो से वह ताल दे रही है। उसके होठों से लिपस्टिक भी लिपटी है और मुस्कान भी। गाने के साथ साथ उसका सारा शरीर एक विशेष अदा के साथ झूम रहा है। पास में दोनों हाथों से झुनझुने से बजाता जो व्यक्ति सारे शरीर को लचका लचका कर ताल दे रहा है, वह निग्रो है। So I'm actually putting my emphasis on the word Negro. Okay. So, in the Hindi heartland, this actually shows the biasness of the writer as well. Negro is actually a much more common sort of term, and we Indians are more racist than any other. So, you see how this word has got into the pen of a major Hindi writer. Okay. But when I'm translating it, or when you are translating it, I think you have to be aware of the etymology, politics, and great amount of identity that is embedded in this particular word Negro. And I was so happy that the recent translation of Mannu Bhandari's short stories, the title of that book is The Wise Woman and Other Stories. There the translator has done what she could in order to deal with this word. What she has done, she has said that a person who was playing on that instrument is from Africa. Okay, so she has completely omitted the word Negro. Of course, then there is this another example, and I've also put a translation of this so as to show our progress, how we are dealing with it. So this is actually a short story by Mamta Kalia, very famous short story. Some people have argued that this is the 10 best short stories of last 4 decades in Hindi. So it says, Darwaja Khula Tha. So Tunya is actually a girl who is 14-15 years of age, on the doorstep of her adolescence. She's trying to understand the world, and the people in the house are giving many works to her. So she has been asked to go and fetch water from downstairs. So this is the scene. दरवाजा खुला था, टुनिया सीधे अंदर पहुंच गई। नल खोल कर देखा, पानी नहीं था। फिर उसने हैंडपंप चलाया, वह भी सूखा पड़ा था। तभी रामजी रसोई से निकल कर आया. Ramji is actually the servant of people who are doctors and very big people. So Ramji is actually a servant in their house, and Dunya is supposed to get water from their house. तभी रामजी रसोई में से निकल कर आया. आज पानी नहीं है, सब खल्लास. टुनिया ने एक बार फिर नल खोलने के लिए हाथ बढ़ाया ही था कि रामजी ने अपने पजामे की ओर इशारा किया और अश्लील ढंग से मुस्कुरा कर कहा, लो इससे भर लो. So as translators, I think the major challenge for us is to deal with these sexual metaphors, to deal with irony, because irony often ends up confusing more than what it can say. So it is important that we develop our own techniques, and this is what you will not get in the space of translation theories, so to speak. So here, this servant is actually hinting towards his sexual organ, and he's saying that why don't you? So in a way, he is actually inviting this girl for an unintended sex. And as a translator, so this is what I have done. The door was opened. Dunya went in. She opened the tap. There was no water. I wish to tell you that since this is actually a description from the perspective of a growing up girl, her language is also very simple. Her language is also growing up. So if you can see in the original, the writer is very much particular that she's using small sentences and she's using a limited vocabulary. So as a translator, I think we cannot lose sight of these particular things. So I am also very conscious in my rendering that I am also in a way measuring the language of the original. The door was opened. Dunya went in. She opened the tap. There was no water. She tried hand pump. It had dried up too. And please also see how the image of hand pump is used as a sexual metaphor in the male world, especially in India. Meanwhile, Ramji emerged from the kitchen. There is no water today, all finished. Dunya had just stretched her hands once more towards the tap when Ramji gestured towards his trouser and said with a filthy smile, fill with this. So, can you notice I have italicized the word this, because this is not an innocent this. This is, he's actually referring to his male sexual organ. So these are some of the improvisations that one can do as translator to bring out the hidden nuances that some of these writers employ. I'm sure that there cannot be a limit to that improvisation, but this is how. There are numerous examples that I can give. For example, in the bit number 3, you have a clash of two lovers. Okay, so one is a truck driver and the other one is a tractor driver. Okay, so the tractor driver is very offended because the girl is giving a lot of space to the truck driver. So the tractor driver wants to tell her. So you see how this mundane image of truck and tractor is actually in the text is actually the metaphor of male sexual prowess of these two people. Okay, so he says Pardesi ka tarak bahut man bhaya hai. Pardesi is the outsider. So this truck driver is an outsider, and this tractor driver is from the same caste of this girl. Okay, so he's much more offended. Pardesi ka tarak bahut man bhaya hai. जाति बिरादरी का एकदम ख्याल नहीं. ट्रैक्टर की ताकत ट्रक से बेसी होती है विमल. कहो तो कोनो दिन लड़ा के दिखा दे. So he's basically talking about that my sexual power is much more powerful than the truck driver. And बिल्लर कहता है विमली खान साहब के भट्टे की हेडलाइट है. You have to decode what this headlight. It's not the headlight as such. It actually refers to the male gaze in the text, that other male workers are able to work 9 to 9 because they have some objects to gauge, and these women have been objectified in the So there are many such examples that I can share, but I'm seriously not sure I have time for that. But I will leave these things with the NTM team. They can share with you later as well if you want. Uh, I mean, it always happens that I'm not able to show everything that I intend to. But one last thing that I would like to share, and by that I would also uh, finish my discussion, is how a text moves in translation and through a translator. Okay, so this is the title poem of the book that I have translated, and it's a very simple, straightforward poem, but it has some vivid images in it. I will read the poem and then I will show you three texts that I drafted in order to translate this particular poem. And that I did for all the poems, in fact. आग की हंसी, जी नहीं, चूल्हे की आग से तो गरम गरम रोटियां निकलती हैं जो बुझाती हैं पेट की ज्वाला और धीरे धीरे आदमी की हंसी बन जाती है। आप जरा आईना देखिए श्रीमान, आपकी शीतल शालीन हंसी से कैसे धीमी धीमी आग फूट रही है और धीरे धीरे अपनी लपेट में ले रही है दिशाओं को महाज्वाला बनकर। फिर भी आपकी माया है कि लोग समझते हैं आग चूल्हे ने लगाई है, आपकी माया कितनी हसीन है मायाधर। Okay, so this is a very powerful critique of the capitalist class in India. And there are three different texts that are available that I have done. So I have this text A. This was my first translation of this particular poem. Okay. And you can read the translation. So I literally almost translated it. So you see, my title is The Fire's Laughter, Aag Ki Hasi. Okay. Then in those days, I was teaching a course on poetry in my department, and there was a wonderful budding poet called Priyadarshi Mishra, somebody like that. Prashant Priyadarshi, yes. So he was writing poems, and some other people were saying that he's very good at writing poems. So I was thinking that I should also take the opinion of a poet when I'm translating a poem. Okay, so I sent this particular draft to Prashant. Okay, and this is what Prashant did with my draft. So he changed the title. He said, "The Laughter of Fire." And as a poet, I think he had very different way of looking at it. And this is what I'm not getting into qualitative analysis of what Prashant did, but I think this is what a poet would eventually do. He changed the title, and he also used these words like, for example, how it begins, nay, and in my case, it is no. Okay, so this is how. But with reasons of my own, I was absolutely disappointed with how Prashant edited it. And then I retranslated it, and this is what appears in the final version of the text that has come out. Okay, so I've called it in my final version, I've called it The Laughing Flames. Okay, I think that is much more in tune with the flow of the text there. And I will read the final version, and I will also leave all the three versions with the NTM team. And you see what I have attempted to do. I can't be befooled, for I know the fire of her produces only the hot and blazing rotis. So I've given a footnote to rotis because roti cannot be translated as bread. Bread has a different sort of process. Rotis that extinguish the fire of the belly and slowly and gradually transcend into man's laughter. So I've capitalized man's laughter because there are two laughters that the poet is trying to, put together in the poem. But your laughter is not the same. Look into your mirror, gentlemen. There you will see how gently and slowly a different fire is making an appearance through your calm and sober laughter, and how slowly and gradually it is engulfing all the directions into its lap by turning itself into a mighty fire. And full credit to your mystery, for people still think that the earth unleashed the fire. Your mystery is beautiful, oh mysterious. So this is how a text should move from one position to the other before we finally reach to it.